Hey, everybody. Welcome to this panel discussion of healthcare breach trends in 2022. What we're talking about today is the healthcare breach report that we put out twice a year. More important than that, John Delano is joining us. And what I just remembered is he doesn't join us for a lot of our panels. And so he still laughs at my jokes, which is a very important thing. Twice a year, beginning of the year, middle of the year, we put out a report for the healthcare breach trends. I assume everybody here has it. Otherwise, you'd be like, what are they talking about? Why are they here? If you need the link to it, just put it in the chat and we'll put a link in the chat. But I assume you already have it. If you don't, yeah, like I said, see Jen's something nice. There you go. Thanks for putting something nice in the chat. So anyway, we do this twice a year. There's always very interesting findings. It's changed every time. Somebody asked me recently, why do you do it? Why do you do it twice a year? Why not do it once a year? And it's because it changes so fast. Like we want to do it twice a year so that people have data where they can respond, where they can do what they need to do in their security programs and have up-to-date information. So a couple of rules of the road here. Number one is over on the right is the chat. If the chat's not up for you, there's a little bubble. Click on a little bubble, chat will come up, and you can type in, as Jen's put in there, something nice. We'd love to know where you're joining from. So if you can put in the chat where you're joining from. I am in Seattle. Fred is up in Skagit County in Washington with the tulips, as you can see. Fred, I assume that's what that background is, and it's not Holland. But if I'm wrong, you can tell me later. And as people get in the room here, wow, we had a lot of people coming in. We'll get going here. So what we're going to do is we're going to do introductions. We're going to tell people why we're here, which is what we're doing now. We're going to then go through the research, and we have a special guest this morning who I'll introduce in a second. And the findings. Then we're going to talk about where this is going. One thing that we would love to do is for you to put questions in the chat so we can interrupt the speakers. It's my favorite thing to do. I love interrupting people, and so put questions in chat. We'll interrupt them. We'll make sure your questions get answered as well. All right, so joining us today, Mike Hamilton, Critical Insight co-founder, former CISO of the City of Seattle. John Delano, who's now at Christus Health. If you joined ones previously, he was at Advent Health, but he traded up for a very nice office, as you can see behind him. He was CIO at Advent Health before. And John, just to give people some perspective here, your title is VP Ministry and Support, but you're really the glue between two departments here.
That's correct. So I have a business relationship management type role where I own the IT relationship across the business.
So really unique perspective, and we're very happy to have John here joining us. Tricia Lowe is the Chief Experience Officer, and she leads customer and market analysis, and she did all the data crunching, which is great because I'm terrible with the spreadsheet. So Tricia, thank you for being here. Fred Langston is Critical Insight co-founder, EVP of Professional Services, and has spent 30 years consulting healthcare organizations on security. And then my name's Jake Milstein. I'm the pretty face and the asker of questions. Mike, take it away.
Okay. Thanks, everybody, for being here. So like we always do, we want to start with some headlines just to put everything in context and get everybody loosened up for this conversation, including us. So these are fairly recent. These are towards the end of the year. Yep, all-time high. So I think we're going to dive into exactly why this is an all-time high. I have some theories of my own, and I think there are some hidden signals in the data here that we can talk about. We're being warned now, right? So hospitals in particular have this variety of challenges around security. They're working on thin margins. There's a pandemic underway. They have very little access to the qualified practitioners that they need on staff And here is the FBI now warning about very specific ransomware that is very specifically being deployed against the health sector, this Lockbit. So if you can look up that article and look up these indicators of compromise, that's what you search your network for to see if they're snooping around in there. Yep, half of the internet connected devices in hospitals are vulnerable to hacks. And other interesting reporting suggests that the health sector may be the biggest beneficiary and let's call it starter of our supply chain security, our software bill of materials, our hardware bill of materials that are being required by the federal government to do business with the federal government. And hopefully the collateral effect of that will be everywhere. Medical devices are probably at the top of that list, that we want to make sure we know exactly what goes into those. So today's world, it's pretty bad. Half of them are vulnerable. That doesn't mean that somebody in Uzbekistan can hack your pacemaker. But to the extent that these devices are available from the internet, that's probably real bad. And here's a couple of articles that I think are adding to the long tail of some of these events. So here's Scripps, who in my estimation did a horrible job when they got hit with ransomware, had to divert patients. They were not communicating properly with their patients. Everybody was in the dark, and now patients are suing them with a class action because of that. And then here is the Attorney General in Rhode Island also in opening up an investigation. And these are not the only examples. So this long tail now includes possibility of a lawsuit, and that risk seems to be going up. So, hospitals are under attack. They're critical infrastructure. Some of the things that the federal government has done, I think, are shifting attacks away from ransomware and back towards records theft. That's a theory. But if we can discuss that a little later, maybe we'll see if that makes sense or not.
Yeah, but and one thing, Mike, and we'll get to the data in a second here. I think if you get hit by if you get hit by ransomware, you have a breach of anything, even if it's not, your fault. Folks are the victims of crimes.
Mm-hmm.
Even if you do everything right, you can still get sued.
Yeah, well, you can get sued less. It's interesting that even the Federal Trade Commission is really getting into this game. So post-event, they're going to come in and look around too. And this probably applies less to the health sector than to, for example, the finance sector. But they'll come looking around, and if the Federal Trade Commission deems that your controls were not consistent with your public pronouncements about your controls, they will fine you as well. So, every lever is being pulled here to try and get organizations to implement standards of practice. In my view, not taking really into consideration the fact that a lot of them can't afford that. You can't get blood from a turnip. But this is where we are.
I'd also like to point out that HIPAA, unlike just about every other regulation, does not require that you show somebody was actually harmed. All you need to show is that your records were exposed and you're then liable and able to be sued. That is unusual, highly unusual in the regulatory landscape.
Okay. Tricia.
Yeah, so kind of to what Fred, you were just talking about, the data that we use for the report is from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services breach portal. There's a screen grab right here. This is a public website. Anyone can go to it. But organizations who experience a breach of personal health info or PHI that impacts 500 or more records have to report that, regardless of what happened with that breach and whether people were actually impacted beyond just their data becoming unsecured. Those breaches are then listed publicly here on the breach portal, which is sometimes called the Wall of Shame. And the portal makes public data about the organization that was involved, the type of breach. It could be improper disposal, it could be theft, or the topic we tend to focus on, hacking and IT incident related. There's other information here, like the number of individuals who are impacted, but we'll start to dive into some of the good stuff.
And I do want to, catch something in the chat here. Jen says HIPAA is not a good example of how to do security. It's a regulation, not a framework, which is part of the problem. And Jonathan points out that there's, there are state regulations too. Fred, I know you've come up against that.
Yeah, there's regulations in just about every state. Here in Washington, there's a whole set of codes relating to, they don't call it PHI, they have another acronym for it, but it's healthcare data. And it's in fact slightly more stringent in some ways than what you would see in HIPAA.
And John,
Well, because healthcare data is a subset of PII, personally identifiable information, and can be used for financial fraud because it still meets that definition. There are statutes in 50 states that say if you lose these kind of records, here's the baseball bat, start hitting yourself with this, right? You have to report it publicly, you have to monitor credit, you have to do all that stuff. So it's a double whammy. Again, the long tail.
Yeah, and John, I know, you're down in Texas. Regulations down there are different, right?
That's right. You just need guns. No, I would add to that. I mean, HIPAA is just a low bar. It's not prescriptive, which is why you would want a framework like HITRUST or NIST to, you wouldn't start building a house if you didn't have a blueprint, and that's why a framework is very helpful when you're building a security program, not relying on a regulation like HIPAA.
Yeah. It's worth noting too that the OCR audit protocols have become very useful in interpreting what the government actually thinks is the standard. And they've been rewritten, I think it was in 2018, to be more question-like, as opposed to do this, it's are you doing this? And it's become, I think, a great measuring stick to figure out what the government is going to look at if they come in your door and audit you.
Yeah, good. So Trisha's now going to go into data about this report. Go ahead, Trisha.
Well, also the data that now, let's just acknowledge is really just the tip of the iceberg, apparently. So as Jake mentioned, we do this report really every 6 months. And since we've started, we've seen the total number of breaches in healthcare grow. And that's what this chart is showing here. It's broken out by the half-year periods since 2018. And we previously talked about a spike we saw in the second half of 2020. There were almost 400 breaches in that period alone. So I have some good news. The good news is we've seen the number of breaches come down a bit in 2021. The first half was around 368, the second half down to 311. The bad news is we are still talking about more breaches than pre-pandemic years and really more breaches than we'd ever seen before. So it's not great.
And so, I don't, based on, what's reporting and what's in the news, actually seeing a drop, I think might be surprising to some folks. John, what do you make of that?
Yeah. So what I noticed in this is that, and we certainly know not all breaches are equal. So just putting a number of breaches up here doesn't tell the story. Certainly in this number of breaches, there are 10 breaches that impacted over 1 million records. And so, while the number of breaches may be slightly down, the number of records impacted is up. And I think that's the bigger story.
Yeah. And of course, there's also the delays in people reporting things, at the beginning of the pandemic. Obviously, it started in, March 2020 is when, some people went to their basements and hospitals went into overdrive, right? And, you see this big jump, John and Fred and Mike, back then, what we were talking about was, people didn't know that there were threat actors in their systems, right?
Yeah, there's the residence time on a couple of these major hacks. Of the top 10 hacks, there was a couple that had 9-month residence times where they were hanging out, looking, exfiltrating data, and then eventually executing ransomware attacks. But 9 months residence time, that's just an enormous amount of time that they're poking around. And these are major healthcare providers that have had this, that tend to have relatively good security, yet they're still able to fly under the radar.
And there's some questions coming in the chat here that I want to put in. I also want to point out, if you are somebody who likes hearing the bloop of the chat, then you're more than welcome to. If you want it to go away, you hit full screen on the bottom, and then you can turn off the full screen on the bottom. You hit the little 3 dots, and you can turn off the little bloop bloop. But a question from Jens, how many incidents are unreported? John, do you think there are a lot that go unreported?
Well, I think it's true that a lot do go unreported. I mean, certainly there's the the requirement that if it's 500 records or less, it doesn't have to be reported, or look at it the other way around, it does if it's over that, right? So there are some that naturally don't get reported because they don't meet the requirement. And certainly you don't want to report it if you don't have to. And so there's that part of it. I have a theory as well that because of the staffing shortage, that some of these have just gone unnoticed, and that could potentially lead to why the numbers might be a little bit lower.
So let's dig into that. So you think, because of the staffing shortage now we're seeing a dip, but it might not be a real dip. The threat actors might be in the systems now, so it might come up later, unfortunately. Is that what you're saying?
It could. I've always operated under the prospect that there are 2 types of networks: one that's been breached and you know it, and one that's been breached and you just yet don't know it.
And a reminder, pre-pandemic, the last figure that was pre-pandemic was that bad guys were in the system for more than 200 days on average before being found, right? North Koreans were inside Sony. Fred, you told me this for a year, right?
Yeah, and I think the thing that a lot of people that changed the game is ransomware brings it to everybody's attention. Hey, we've been hacked, and that's when we find out. But the reality is, a lot of people don't know until the FBI calls them up and says, "We see your data for sale on the dark web," and they have no idea that any of this has happened. And it's only when somebody's patient data is out there being sold that the alarm bells start going off. And I frankly believe, especially related to the Exfiltration hack, which is a ubiquitous tool that was used all over. I had my data stolen twice last year because of the Exfiltration hack. That there are entities out there that don't still know that they were hacked as part of that, because they aren't thinking about that as the main way that they would get hacked. They're waiting for ransomware to go off and their system to be shut down.
Yeah, and just with respect to Exfiltration, they just settled and they're paying $8.1 million for all the damage that was done by their product and their failure to get it all patched. I want to ask a question about data we're looking at here. Why do we think that in every year prior, probably with the exception of 2018 there, why H2 is greater than H1, and that trend seems to have been reversed in 2021? Is that late reporting of data? Because I think our data are fairly complete. I have a theory as to that, but I'm interested in anyone else's.
Well, that actually has been stated by DHHS that they're still waiting for the 2021 Q4 data to roll in, and they expect those numbers to go up significantly. They say they expect it to be well over 700 million records being stolen, and they're expecting that number to go up. That's what I've been reading.
Okay, because to me, that's right about the time when the administration said, okay, we're not having it with this knocking down the hospitals anymore. You use ransomware against a hospital, you're a terrorist. You steal records, then you're a criminal. And that pretty much corresponds to that timing. So, but if we're waiting for more data, I would anticipate that it would go up.
I mean, some people aren't even past the reporting period yet, right? So, and then a lot of them still haven't figured out how bad it's been.
Well, and can't they withhold reporting if there's an active investigation?
For a small period of time, yes. But the fact is, it still can take 3-4 months to figure out how many records were and whose records were actually compromised. There was a couple breaches this year. One of them had 45 million records that were lost, but they only had 4,000 they could identify that were actually fully compromised. But the reality is it's probably all 45 million.
Well, and so That gets to something that's going on in the chat. Sorry to interrupt you, Fred, but Greg says, what's a different definition of a breach? Is it only based on patient records leaving the org? And then Jonathan said, I would say some hospitals don't know the regulations. There's, they claim they didn't lose PHI information. I mean, if you know that criminals got into your system, but you can't tell whether they exfiltrated anything, John, did they still need to report?
So again, I think part of what we're seeing is just the confusion with the regulations, and the terminology is confusing. The what to do, what it means, it's all confusing, right? And so, to answer your question, Jake, yes, they should and they need to, but maybe they think they don't. And so, I've been a part of an investigation where a device was compromised that had 2,000 records on it, and we were able to do some forensics and identify that only 10 records had been, had been accessed. So by law, we didn't have to report it because we only had 10 records, and so there could be some of that transpires as well.
I think there's a converse to that as well, in that we see many small organizations do not have the appropriate logging turned up and the appropriate artifacts to determine whose records were breached, even though they know their entire organization was. Therefore, they have to report that every record that they have was breached because they can't make a definitive determination. Strangely enough, that may be driving the number up when in fact it could potentially be lower. So a lot of weird factors can become involved.
And as the folks here know, I just came back from the American Hospitalization Rural Conference in Phoenix, and talked to somebody there who might have had a breach. And the problem is the person who reports breaches left the organization, to John's point, left the organization in October, and they're hiring a person. And when they hire somebody, if they can hire somebody, that person, probably first thing they need to do is to report that breach. So, let me move to the next slide so we can get some more of the data in here. But there you go.
Yeah, so I think it's interesting. We saw it coming down a little bit in those 6-month periods, but when we look at the annual numbers,
I lost all audio.
So did I.
Whoop, can you all hear? Can everybody hear me?
Oh, there you go.
All right. Well, that was exciting.
Your lips move, but I cannot hear what you're saying.
Okay. Well, it looks like we lost Trisha there for a second. Sorry about that. So it's probably the Russians. So, if you look at total breaches, individuals affected over time, you can see here that even though on the last slide we saw fewer breaches, more individual records were affected. And that is in part because of those third-party breaches, like Fred, you were talking about Excellion, where you lost your records twice, and congratulations on that. John, you looked at the data first. When you see this and you see that more individuals have lost, or more individual records were lost in the last year, what does that make you think?
Yeah, I just think it, to me, it goes to the level and sophistication. We touched a little bit on supply chain attacks, and certainly healthcare utilizes a lot of similar applications, and so by attacking through that vector, you can impact a lot more records or number of records.
And Trisha's back here, which is good. Trisha, welcome back.
thanks.
Trisha's learning that shouldn't have work done on the house the day of the webinar, but happens to the best of us. So I talked over this slide, Trisha, so I'm going to pop on to the next slide here.
Great. So we did a little bit of a deep dive here into who is getting breached. And from the top chart, you can see that healthcare providers are by and far the largest group. So this top graph is really just showing the relative percentage of total breaches by kind of a type of entity. So while they make up a smaller portion of the breaches, one of the trends that we noticed is that business associates and health plans are getting breached at an increasing rate. It's a little easier to see that in the table that's below the chart. So while overall breaches have trended up, specifically for health plans, they increased 35% from 2020 to 2021, and business associate breaches increased 18% from 2020 to 2021. Providers were actually down a little bit.
And Mike and Fred and John, what do you make of that? Why do you think the change there?
Well, I look at the health plan one, and what comes to my mind is Exfiltration. Again, that probably is a common denominator. That's a widely used file transfer agent product. Health plans are the kinds of companies that are doing massive amounts of intracompany and with provider file transfers. They tend to be pretty good overall. And for them to have that increase, I think there's some common denominator, and I would probably point my finger at Exfiltration here.
Well, not only that, but I mean, it's just in general. So the letter of the law is if you are service provider, vendor, whatever, to a covered entity, a hospital, you are technically under the provisions of HIPAA yourself. You can be audited against HIPAA, but when we're talking about, right, business associate is very unspecific there, right? And if you're a business associate to a hospital and what you do is you sell urinal cakes to them, you are unlikely to have the kind of controls in place that the hospital does. And so you become that unlocked window. I think that's it too, right? They're the lower hanging fruit.
Of all of the things you could have picked, you picked urinal cakes. Thanks.
I got to think of something.
John, go ahead.
I was going to say that's the day I quit when I get breached by my urinal cake provider.
That's fair. That's
okay,
fair.
Bad choice. Okay.
We're going to move. I had a question, but I lost it there. So we're going to move to the next slide. Trisha, go ahead.
All right. So one of the findings in the data is that when those business associates are breached, it does tend to impact a lot more individuals. So on the left-hand side, this is just showing the percentage of all the breaches. On the right-hand side is the percentage of records. And so while business associates accounted for around 13% of the total breaches in 2021, those breaches were responsible for nearly 24% of the overall records impacted. So pretty significant difference there.
But still the healthcare providers are most of them, John. It has gone down, but the healthcare, focusing on healthcare providers, patient-centric organizations still are the lion's share of breaches. It's not like it's time to relax.
Agreed. And it'll continue to be that way, in my opinion.
All right, let me hit the next slide.
Do we think at all that market's getting played out, that everybody who's been hit is going to get hit and they're running out of targets, because after, you have an event like that, you generally get religion and a lot of funding from your organization and get stuff fixed. And so I'm wondering if all the pummeling that the health sector has taken has resulted in an uptick in security overall. And that's why they're looking for different unlocked windows.
Well, I'm going to point out the M&A frenzy in healthcare is muddying that picture because we see a lot of very large, well-secured healthcare entities bringing on smaller clinics that have almost no budget for security.
True.
And if they're integrating those rapidly, they're actually integrating their vulnerabilities and ability to be exploited into the larger organization. I think there's some of that, but in the long run, the M&A work will probably increase the security overall of those major healthcare providers because we're finally have the funding and the budgets to have the small clinical environments secured at the same level as the hospital.
Fred, I'm so glad you just said that right before I'm showing this data. So going back to healthcare providers, since that is the largest segment in terms of total breaches, most of those breaches are related to hacking and IT incidents, and that's true across the board. We dug into this a little bit more. So HHS broadly categorizes the organizations who are reporting breaches. For our research, we took it one step further and wanted to break out micro segments. Specifically, we wanted to look at whether the healthcare provider was part of a hospital system or whether it was an outpatient or specialty clinic. And there are other micro segments, but these two tend to be where most of the breaches are concentrated. This is also where the disruptions tend to be pretty visible to the entire community. So it's not just the individuals whose PHI is becoming unsecured, it is actually impacting patient care across the board. So when we look at this data over time, here we're showing 2019, 2020, and 2021. The blue bars, which will be on the left, are the number of hacking-related breaches that are reported by the clinics. The green bars, which are on the right, are the number of hacking-related breaches that are reported by the hospital systems. Back in 2019 and previous years, they were pretty similar raw numbers. Clinics were at 75, hospitals at 64. In 2020, both groups went up, but significantly more hospitals were reporting hacking-related breaches. It went from 64 to 124, whereas outpatient went from 75 to 93. In 2021, we saw hospital numbers actually come down a bit, still higher than pre-pandemic, but down to 80 breaches that were reported. Clinics, though, continued that prior trend and actually increased to 131 reported breaches, outpacing hospital systems. So I'm really curious what's going on here.
Yeah, I mean, John, what do you think?
So I think some of it is due to these specialty clinics to others relying more heavily on technology than they have in the past. And, you know, certainly as we get into consumer-centric technologies where we're putting a lot more tools in the hands of, and healthcare has to get used to using the term consumer as opposed to patients, but requiring more technology, less personal touch points. So online scheduling on down the line, right? More, I think it's just more technology getting out into these outpatient and specialty clinics.
You know, go ahead, Mike. Were you going to say something?
I just think the perps are going down market too. You know, Tricia had an interesting theory about organizations that rely on elective surgery and how, because that was all disrupted because of COVID, they lost a whole lot of revenue. And when you got to cut something because you're losing revenue, security is usually the first thing on the chopping block. That actually might be a hidden signal in there as well. You know, and we've actually heard a little bit of a confirmation of that. So just an observation there.
You know, one of the things this week I told you I was at the AHA Rural Conference. So I gave a cybersecurity talk, and I really what I did.
You did? Really?
No, really, I just introed John Rigi, who's the head of cybersecurity for the
Much
AHA.
more believable.
I know, that's fair. And we talked to ransomware victims at Sky Lakes and at Dickinson Memorial, both of which had ransomware attacks during the pandemic. And that was the panel. When I introed, I said, all right, everybody raise your hands. Tell me if you're a board member or you work in the hospital. And more than half of the room was board members. And I talked to somebody from the AHA before, and they were very surprised by that because they said, you know, historically, board members have not come to the cybersecurity you know, they've come to the revenue, they've come to the Medicare, they've come to, you know, those sessions, and they made the choice. In fact, they made the choice so much that we did 2 sessions, not just one, on ransomware. And both times, the majority of the people in the audience were board members. So we're seeing more board members, you know, interested in this. And I think it's because of, you know, everything we've seen. But then, you know, we see what got put in the chat here. Somebody said, yeah, you know, they get interested for a short period of time, and then the funding goes away. I don't know, John, you know, what do you think? Do boards stay interested, or is this a blip in interest?
I've seen that, and I saw the comment in the chat. I do think that organizations have short-term memory. Certainly, what have you done for me lately? And I do think that a breach can cause a short-term uptick in providing resources to add protection, do those kind of things. But these little things called budgets come around every year, and there are lots of factors that go into that. And in a lot of cases, IT and I lump information security under IT are asked to keep their budgets flat or not increase. And so, in essence, that's a cut if you have to keep your budget flat. And so you're looking for ways to make up for that deficit, because organizations continue to grow and expand, and mergers and acquisitions. So I would agree with that, Jake.
I want to mention that I spoke at the same conference in 2018, and the awareness level then was almost non-existent. And what you're telling me, Jake, is a major increase in awareness that I'm very encouraged by, because I was kind of I've heard I've heard of this stuff, but you're the first person that's ever talked to us about that. And if they're actually coming and understanding that this is a key driver, all of a sudden, change is going to come, I believe.
You don't think liability is a driver there, right? The potential for being accused of gross negligence because you're the board and you weren't asking those questions, because that's what everybody in the private sector is having to do right now.
I don't know, Mike. I mean, I'm sure that negligence plays a part in it, and seeing, lawsuits and the like. But the group who I talk to are, for the most part, are on hospital board. They're not doctors. They never worked in a hospital. It was the Rural Hospital Conference. So like, they own grain collectives, they're bank presidents, they're, members of the community, but they deeply care about the hospitals. They have various reasons for being on the board, but they all have that altruistic, I want to be on the hospital board because I want to help the community and I want to help people. And I think one of the things that I heard universally is, the idea that somebody could die because of a hacker is why I'm here. So that's the feeling I got. Now, I'm sure there's, they also don't want to get sued, but their chief motivation what was encouraging. What I don't know is, does that stick around? Fred, you've been to those conferences, you've seen folks for a while. Does the funding stick around? And then, John, I have a question for you about where the funding's going right now. But Fred, what do you think?
Well, I think this is still very much a black box to those board members, and it's the high profile. Somebody could be hurt, somebody could die. I think those things actually resonate. I'm not sure if the liability issue is actually on anybody's real radar at that level, because nobody's ever really suffered on a hospital board yet that I know of from something happening. But if a patient dies, I think that is something they do care about. That's the reason they're there. And I think that's what's driving the awareness level.
And, John, the other big thing that came up there was the price of nurses. So you can tell the story better than I can, but you've always had I guess hospitals have always had a certain percentage of in-house nurses and a certain percentage of traveling nurses. And right now, because of the Great Resignation, because of the pandemic, because of burnout, more traveling nurses than ever and more expensive. And so, everybody was talking about, the paying $150 an hour. One hospital was paying $6,000 or $7,000 a week for nurses. And then what I heard folks saying is, with that, we can't, we can't do that and pay for cybersecurity.
Yeah, certainly. So, and it impacts more than just cybersecurity, but what we're seeing in healthcare right now is especially with spikes in certain areas, you're seeing a greater demand for nurses because you've got full beds, and so as people learn what they can make as a contract nurse or an agency nurse versus being employed, We're starting to see in some cases where nurses are flipping to contract, and sometimes getting contracts at the same hospital they just quit from, but making $150 an hour instead of $40 an hour. And so that contract labor rate is so expensive and so high that hospitals have to make cuts somewhere. Most not-for-profit healthcare organizations run on 2, 3, 4% margins, which is already pretty thin. And so something as significant as paying contract rates really eats away at those margins.
We also do a lot of security in the last 2 years for organizations that provide traveling nurses. They've taken a much greater interest. I mean, I'd never spoken to one of those organizations before the last couple of years, and we've had 3 or 4 come in and do some great work securing their environments. But again, it's not quite the same as securing the hospital or clinical environment. You're thinking of it more of a corporate perspective, and there is some EPHI that is being traded between those organizations. But it's a good sign that they're taking advantage of security as well now.
I just want to tie off this issue about the boards of directors, and this is why yesterday we wrote up an executive brief that was specifically to be distributed to boards of directors, so they knew what questions to ask the CEO, the CFO, etc., about security. And we broke it up into 3 really simple areas, so even the farmer, the grain elevator guys can do it.
Yeah, I mean, what I actually, John Rigi at AHA has written, I think, a 5 or 6 page document on what boards should do. And what I heard from board members there was, I need a 1-pager. And so we broke it up into the way boards should be asking about cybersecurity. If folks we haven't actually published it yet, but if folks would like that or want to give me feedback on it before we send it to any board members, I'll put my email address in here and I'll send it over to you. Anyway, yeah. Jonathan puts, I like the farm people. Does that come with a coloring book?
I'd like to add, Jake, too, because I see in the comments, I'm certainly an advocate for nurses. I'm not blaming nurses for this situation, just simply explaining the fact that money has to come from somewhere. And completely agree that nurses, like school teachers, don't get paid near enough for what they do. In fact, I have a daughter that is a nurse, so I'm in no ways blaming the financial situation on nursing or nurses, and apologize if that insinuation came across.
Yeah, I didn't hear you say that. Maybe somebody did. What I did hear at the conference was a lot of people blaming the folks, Fred, who you were talking about, which is the nurse supply people who are taking 30% of, anyway, but that's a different conversation. That's not what we're not going to go down that rabbit hole. I want to get back to security here, because one of the things, one of the other things that everybody was talking about at the conference is telemedicine. With the quick advancement of telemedicine in the pandemic, John, do you think we're going to see an uptick in breaches, based on use of that technology? In fact, one of the hospitals built an entire wing of doctors and patients doctors and nurses who will never see anybody physically, they will always be remote, they'll always do telemedicine. They're somewhere, I forget where they are, but somewhere rural, but they're doing worldwide telemedicine. So, John, do you think that's going to become a new avenue of breaches, telemedicine providers?
I think, certainly that technology is getting in more and more hands. During the pandemic, we saw a need to extend that technology out to as many folks as we could for the right reasons. And the regulations were relaxed during that period, so that those technologies could be leveraged. I think the advantage that we have in telemedicine is that it's newer technology that's being written with security in mind. And so So that certainly has its advantages, unlike many of the legacy applications that we deal with in healthcare that weren't written with security in mind. I think those are the ones that still give us the biggest exposure.
I point out that every telemedicine appointment I've had, and I've had quite a few in the last 2 years, have been over Zoom. So Zoom is the platform in which all this telemedicine that I've been involved with has been being delivered. And then you're talking about Zoom being, the security of Zoom being critical to, preventing somebody from using that as an avenue of attack. But I'd also point out that telemedicine tends to be a single patient experience with a doctor, and the bad guys want databases with millions of patient records, and getting a singular a singular event is not really very lucrative at all,
Yeah.
unless of course they can use Zoom or whatever the platform is as a way into an organization.
And in terms of one of the things we saw is more records being stolen. You know, does it seem, Fred, like ransomware is being used less now in favor of stealing more records? And why, and when they steal records, is it that they're interested only in the healthcare data? What's going on there?
Well, I think there's believe it or not, the bad publicity of how bad hackers must be, how evil they must be to do something that would impact some innocent person's health when really they're just trying to get money. So I think that there is actual motivator there for them to focus back on why they're really doing this. And that's it's to make money, right? And selling records has always been one of the most lucrative. Health records are the most lucrative records of all to sell. And the fact that the government has a lot of programs now for health, to where you can take advantage of government money, having people's health records. There are a lot more ways to monetize those records than ever before. So I think that's a big part of it. Is ransomware just is so messy and can have such a blowback effect. And every ransomware event now is also preceded by data exfiltration. Many of the largest breaches in 2021 were attempted ransomwares. They weren't able to actually execute the ransomware, but they did make payoffs and had to do reporting because of the exfiltrated data that happened before the ransomware actually happened.
So, it could be improving controls that are going into place, right? Like monitoring, right? We can kick them out faster. Maybe that's why ransomware has kind of fallen off, right? And remember, that does come after the data exfiltration. But I'll go back to this. 6 months ago, federal government said, you use ransomware at a hospital, you are a terrorist. And we have a whole different set of tools to deal with you. And that really got a lot of the attention of a bunch of these gangs. I will point out, too, that the variety of tools is substantial, and we're not screwing around here, right? So it's, the executive orders from the administration. It's the fact the Department of Treasury has been brought in so that the Office of Foreign Asset Control is monitoring and mitigating payments that are made through the blockchain using cryptocurrency. And they're saying, okay, look, before you couldn't send any kind of payment over to this country because they're on our bad list. Now you can't send any money to these wallets. And they're monitoring all of that. And so if you do that, you pay that, you have just broken the law. So that's a tool. The Department of Justice is catching and prosecuting people. And the Department of Defense is melting their infrastructure. So they're backing off from this. Extortion is extortion. You flatten a hospital and extort, you steal the records and extort, you're still doing the same thing. So one of those is safer than the other, and I think that's a signal there. But I will say this too, and this is reported sometime this week. I think it was in the news blast a couple of days ago. Text of a chat among these ransomware operators said stuff like, "Ha! Look how fast the hospitals call us back." Right? They know, and there's this Lockbit stuff. They know targeting hospitals is lucrative, and so it's not going to stop. But I do think it is going to abate, and it has nothing to do with the morality of these characters.
No, I mean, certainly not morality as they go. I mean, remember at the beginning of the pandemic, they said we're not going to attack hospitals. Well, that turned out to be a lie now, didn't it? But Mike, you've also talked about their changing tactics, and Jonathan, brings up one here in the chat, which is criminals paying employees to attack their network. We've seen some, when if they can't get an answer from the attacked organization, they call their victims. And you also talked about Killware in 2022.
Yeah. So, right. I mean, and now that we're having, diplomatic and military uncertainty in another part of the world, and one of the actors there is well known to be associated with its organized crime groups and sometimes hide nation state acts behind the guise of organized, oh, it was ransomware, um, you know, there's a lot of uncertainty right now in how this is going to go down. And I think that we should be preparing for some bad stuff to happen here. And because the table has been set, we know ransomware operators go after hospitals. Well, if Russia decides they don't like, we're moving troops over into some NATO country, hospitals could start falling faster, and it looks like ransomware, but it's just designed to just knock you down. They're not actually going to extort. So the dumb word that has come up to describe it as killware. Yeah, I think this is a dangerous time right now. So, I'm sorry, I don't have anything happy to say about that.
I don't know that people come to these to look for happy information, but I mean, I think people do come to figure out what to do about it. This is the part where, I talk a little bit about what we do. So Mike, thanks for setting me up there. And then we'll get to final thoughts from everybody here in a second. And don't forget, I still have that survey for folks. But here's the wheel of services that we provide. We watch networks 24/7. We see that differently than our competitors. We see it as incident preparedness and incident response. We have worked with the American Hospital Association to become we were their very first preferred provider of services. And that includes vulnerability testing, MDR, HIPAA risk assessments. We also do vCISO work. That's actually come up a lot in the pandemic because of something John said, which is people losing staff. And so, we help folks with vCISO work. Fred, you've seen a real uptick in people looking for vCISO work and other things here, right?
Absolutely. And it's across all spectrums. It's not just hospitals. It's all the differing business associates, even lab companies that provide lab testing, which actually don't fall under HIPAA in most cases, are rushing to the table to secure their infrastructure. So we're talking to everybody at this point, and everybody is taking a top-down view of this. It's not, hey, come in and do a pen test. It's, hey, we need a program. We need a way to manage this risk, full time.
And I think important, we have on here security awareness training. Folks do, we can do custom security awareness trainings. We also do free every other week security awareness training. If your employees need to go through it, if you need to go through it, if you want a really entertaining hour on a Friday, it's tomorrow. If anybody needs a link to it, just email me, jake@criticalinsight.com, and I'll kick you a link. Although if you're getting our emails, you probably get invited to it. And that's definitely worth knowing. My cell phone number, email address, Mike's is on there as well. Let's, while we have this up, do some final thoughts here. Trisha, you crunch the data. We appreciate that you crunch the data for us very much. And Trisha's going to do it again in 6 months. We just signed her up for it live on this call. Trisha, as you look at the data, any thoughts you have?
I'm really curious to see what happens with the trend. I think both the thing we were talking about, as more gets reported a little bit after the period has ended, we'll have a little bit more data about that in 6 months. And I'm just going to keep an eye on the business associates health plans increasing, and then overall, do we see it go back down, or have we sort of reached my least favorite phrase of the pandemic, a new normal?
That is my least favorite too, actually.
I like the before times. That's my favorite term.
The before times.
Yeah, I said least favorite.
Also, hey folks, also I'm going to put in the chat the link to the survey. Just remember, when you take the survey, you can either get a gift card or donate it to a food bank, something that we started in the after times, which is the opposite of the before times, which just means in the pandemic. Hey, John, final thoughts?
Yeah, from my perspective, regardless of the numbers, it's obvious that the challenges continue to mount, and honestly, there's no end in sight. Even some of the challenges that we mentioned, like staffing, supply chains that are getting more and more complex and harder to navigate. So we have to continue to be diligent. We have to fight through this. And I would just say, seek an organization like Critical Insight that can add value to the security program you already have and what you're doing.
Fred, final thoughts.
So I'm going to make the prediction that 2022, in the voice of Comic Book Guy, is going to be the worst year ever.
What about the happiness, Fred? Happy. All right. Now,
Worst year ever.
Speaking of happiness, Mike, final thoughts.
So, the final thought is, if you don't want to show up on the wall of shame, go after the thing that causes the most damage, right? So more than 75% of these attacks are caused by human failures, not some technology glitch. Okay. That's more like 25%. 90% of these start with a phishing email. Okay. So, and this is unpopular. If you really want to do the thing that will move the needle the most, stop letting your people use email if they don't need email at all, and prohibit the use of personal stuff at work, right? No email, no social media, no nothing, because those are the vector. You can't control what comes in through that door. You can control what comes in through the email that you manage yourself. So if you want to move the needle a lot, rescind the policy of de minimis use and watch this stuff go off a cliff.
Thanks, guys, and thank you, Tricia, very much. On behalf of all of us at Critical Insight, thanks for coming today. And don't forget to take the survey. Also, if you need another copy of the breach report, let us know. We're happy to give it to you, and we'll do this again in 6 months. I don't usually say this at the end, but I really hope Fred is wrong. I really hope that this is the last. Yeah, Mike.
You want to distro that executive brief for feedback for anybody?
I will. Yep. Email me and I will, jake@criticalinsight.com. I'll send it out to folks. Right now, we just have it in a Word document, so we got to make it a little prettier and fix a couple of typos in it, but happy to send that out. And either you can share that with your boards or not, but we'd love some feedback.
Especially if they're farmers.
Well, you go to the Rural Health Conference and, a lot of folks there. So anyway, thank you, everybody. We really appreciate it. Have a great rest of the week. And we'll see you next time. And again, here's hoping Fred's wrong.
Yep.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.